There'd be times when I'd be like, okay, do we want to do this? No one would say a word. And so I'd have to be like, well, if no one's saying anything, then we will go with this unless there are any objections. And then it was like, no one would say anything. I'd be like, okay, it goes in. Like, I'm pretty sure that because I just chose what thing to say next, I may have put incredibly important things into the protocol just because no one felt like saying anything or something.
On this episode, we talk with Hudson Jameson, who is a VP at Polygon Labs and also led the Ethereum core devs call for quite a while at the Ethereum Foundation. So really a very rich history with Ethereum. Kevin, I'm curious what you took away from this conversation with Hudson.
Yeah, this is amazing. I always appreciate chatting with Hudson. I just love how passionate he is about Ethereum, and he's such a friendly character. He chatted about what it's like to be the social layer consensus mechanism as sort of the head of all core devs, and how he's translated that skill into his time now at Polygon. So it was really enlightening. He's always a wealth of knowledge. Yeah. Anything you took away?
We talked about EIP1, which was just insane. And I hadn't really thought about the fact that there was an EIP1. So yeah, we really got deep into Ethereum's history, and it was a really interesting episode. Hudson has so much experience doing just about a million things at the EF and at Polygon. So it was an incredible episode, and I hope you all enjoyed as much as we enjoyed recording it. We are here with Hudson Jameson, who is the VP of Community at Polygon, but also has a really rich history in the Ethereum ecosystem. So Hudson, very excited to have you on the pod.
Yes, I'm really excited to be here. This is the podcast where I heard that like I can share my alpha on tokens. You tell me which ones to buy or sell. We basically make a security together, right?
This is the financial advice podcast.
Okay, great. I'm on the right one.
Not financial advice.
Just
We will not be talking about
advice.
that.
This is entirely a joke. I'm just like the Polygon. What's it? Polygon legal team's just sweating right now.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, Hudson, I'm very excited to talk with you actually about sort of all things opposite, shit coins, and really get into your work with the EF and all of the wonderful things that you've done in the space. You're a really, prominent figure who's done a ton of work. So very excited to get into it. We've been kind of mixing it up. Sometimes we jump into background, sometimes we don't with guests. I think for you, it's particularly helpful because, like I mentioned, you have quite the background in terms of running all core devs calls for the EF and all that. So maybe you can get into some of your background on how you got into the space and some of the early work that you did into the space.
Sure. So I've been involved in blockchain related things since 2011. I was in college at the time getting a computer science degree, and I forgot how, but I discovered Bitcoin. So I started mining it, started playing around with it, trying to understand it more as I was trying to learn computer science. After I graduated with my CS degree in 2014, I started working for a bank called USAA. It's like a bank and insurance company for the military. Oh, I guess around that time, also the Ethereum presale happened, and I was a contributor more at the community level and like some of the infrastructure level to Darkcoin, which was one of the first privacy coins in 2013 or 14. But it turned into Dash. So if y'all have heard of Dash, that's what it is now. And I'm just like, about it because they kind of left the privacy thing. So anyways, it's 2014. I'm doing mainframe development at USAA. That sucked. I hate mainframes. I hate all of that kind of stuff just because it doesn't click with me. In general programming, I'm not like super great at programming, but I get it and I can do it. So yeah, in the middle of 2014 or more 2015, I annoyed my bosses so much talking about blockchain that they moved me to the innovation lab at USAA, where I worked on enterprise blockchain in 2015, which, if you can imagine, was not a very big space. They were very early in that regard, but I did get a deep dive into both what the latest stuff was happening when it came to like smart contract based chains, because they weren't even released yet, basically. Like Ethereum was just about to launch that year. And also seeing like what IBM was trying to do with enterprise blockchains and stuff like that. During that time, I got wildly obsessed with Ethereum. I did a good amount volunteering in the community, doing stuff like writing the Homestead documentation. I went to DevCon 1 in London in end of 2015 and got to know a lot of the people from heavily volunteering at that conference. One of them was the executive director at the Ethereum Foundation, Ning Chan, who brought me on in the middle of 2016 to run DevCon and lead the DevOps team. So that was kind of my first segment. And then I really dove into a bunch of different things. I was at the EF from 2016 to 2021. And during that time, I did a variety of roles because Ethereum was much smaller then. I even did a year of comms and HR for the Ethereum Foundation. The whole time I was a DevOps lead, so kind of infrastructure and servers. And then I also did about 3 years as the organizational security lead, so like OrgSec person that does passwords, credentials, policies. And then the biggest thing that I guess most people know me about while I was at the EF was the work with the EIP repo, the Ethereum Improvement Proposals, which is our specifications GitHub repository. I helped rewrite EIP 1 in 2016 and was one of the lead EIP editors for many years after that. I also started the Ethereum cat herders in that time, so they could be note takers during core developer meetings. They could help with EIPs and education. I did a lot of community building at that time as like a moderator of Reddit and one of the only voices for the Ethereum Foundation because they were very quiet. And so I guess the other thing that you mentioned was the all core devs chat. So, and meetings. Every 2 weeks, the core developers of Ethereum, so the ones that build the clients, deal with protocol and research, the networking layer, everything under dApps is how I like to think about it. They meet, and while they're meeting, they decide things like what goes into the next network upgrades. If there's like a problem on chain, they get together because as Ethereum is a multi-client environment, we pick that for resilience. There's a lot of coordination that has to happen, and it's very difficult sometimes to figure out what the community wants, what the core devs want, and have everyone work together. But it's working out seemingly pretty well now. And I did that until 2021. So I did a ton of those meetings. And then in the end of 2021, I worked for Flashbots for a little bit and then took a mental health break at the beginning of 2022 all the way until the beginning of 2023 when I started working for Polygon. I was advising Polygon before then. I also have advised Chainlink from the beginning for a few years and Status and a few other companies. Very last thing, when I mentioned that I really like the privacy coin stuff, I did spend a few years in the Zcash community helping start their grants program. I got elected to the first batch of community grants that they get money from a block reward. I think that might be it. Yeah.
That's it, but lots of things in that process. Yeah. I think we want to dive into all of the different elements of that. But I think to start, I mean, you mentioned being part of EIP 1, and now we're on, thousands, I think many thousands. Yeah. I know many thousands. I don't know how close we are to 10,000, but there's a lot of EIPs now. Absolutely. Well past 4,000, I know. Maybe you could talk about what EIP 1 actually was and what the process for creating that was.
Yeah, so actually the story of how EIPs began is pretty interesting. So, old Ethereum, so 2014 to 2017 or so, kind of old guard Ethereum when people like Charles Hoskinson and Gavin Wood hadn't completely jumped to build their own stuff yet, was very chaotic behind the scenes. If anyone's read Laura Shin's book, it kind of describes a lot of the chaos in early Ethereum Foundation and the Ethereum community. So DevCon 1 still had a lot of the early leadership in the Ethereum Foundation and Ethereum before people left for projects. So the idea was, Bitcoin has BIPs, and even before Bitcoin, Python has PIPs, so Python Improvement Proposals, Bitcoin Improvement Proposals. So I think it was Gavin Wood, maybe, who went on stage at DevCon 1 and announced we have Ethereum Improvement Proposals. And some of the original people who were editors on that, so they had push rights on there and stuff like that, were Martin Beasy, who was a very early Ethereum contributor, helped contribute to eWASM, the EVM. Ethereum JS was pretty much started by him. And then also Vitalik and Gavin and a few other of the technical people at the Ethereum Foundation. So they started that. And if you look at the first 20 EIPs, it's mostly Vitalik and a few people here and there. For the first year, it was kind of not being used much. And I think part of the reason for that was everyone who was working on a client for Ethereum was basically in the same room or in the same 2 organizations or 3 organizations. So it was less of a, we need to write out a whole spec for this. It was we have the yellow paper, which is a document Gavin Wood came up with that mathematically defined the specification. So they would just update that. So Ming, who was my boss at the time, the executive director of the Ethereum Foundation, talked to me at the end of 2016 about taking it over and, kind of fixing it up and stuff, because really EIP1 was almost a carbon copy of Bitcoin improvement proposals. Like you can even go back and kind of see all the way back if you go to the changes in GitHub for each commit, how it's progressed over time. So looking all the way back there, it was kind of a thing where the editors weren't really, it wasn't like there was a huge backlog of people contributing anyway, but it wasn't even very known. So I didn't do anything to like, whoa, everybody use this necessarily, but it did become a thing where as I started the core developer calls at the end of 2016 as well, I basically encouraged people to use it. We wrote EIP1, I think at some point in 2017, because we had started having ERCs, which are like EIPs, but they're more for token standards and non-protocol standards and ones that don't require a hard fork, a network upgrade, etc. So now I actually heard recently that they separated the ERCs or like the token standards and other standards from the EIPs repo, which has been a debate back and forth forever. But yeah, so basically I redid parts of EIP1 to kind of make it a little more friendly. I think I put like a graphic in there and just kind of make it a little bit more accessible.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think of the EIP process and the all core dev calls as sort of like a social layer consensus, which as the organizer for those, you were sort of the social layer consensus builder, maybe something like a sequencer. What did you learn from the process of having to coordinate all of these different perspectives?
Especially at first when it comes to developers and like an ecosystem like this, where it's, especially back then, was pretty much only highly technical. There wasn't a lot of dApps. People just want to code and they don't want to make decisions. Like even the people who were well known in the core client community and stuff, they didn't always want to be the only one talking during that. And I would have a lot of times, if you look at the early videos of it in the first few years, there'd be times when I'd be like, okay, do we want to do this? No one would say a word. And so I'd have to be like, well, if no one's saying anything, then we will go with this unless there are any objections. And then it was like, no one would say anything. I'd be like, okay, it goes in. Like, I'm pretty sure that like, because I just chose what thing to say next, I may have put incredibly important things into the protocol just because no one felt like saying anything or something. So something else I learned is that there's so many different stakeholders in Ethereum that a lot of my job back then, and what eventually kind of led me to burnout, was having to juggle both translating the stuff that would happen in the core dev calls to the community and making sure whatever the community's input was came back to the core dev calls. So because the core dev calls, from the beginning, I was like, they need to be very transparent. So you can go to the Ethereum/PM repo and on the README, you can scroll down and there is a huge chart of like all of the core dev calls. And back in the beginning, like the first few years of it, there was a video. So I would like live stream a video. And then after I did the stream, I would spend 2-3 hours writing notes. So you can still go back and see my notes. Now the Ethereum Cat Herders does it and has bounties for them. But I'd have the notes, I would have the video. And what I did that for was there were so many other communities where it'd be like, we don't know what the devs are doing, da 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 da. So I was just like, okay, here's too much information. Like, you're not going to understand it, but like anyone can go in and see why we made decisions and da 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 da. That got iterated over time. In fact, Tim Byko and then from the Ethereum Foundation and Christine Kim from Galaxy Digital separately do write-ups after calls as well as the Cat Herder notes. So there's like now multiple ways to consume what's happening at the core protocol layer. So yeah, the getting stakeholders together. In fact, there were some big calls, like 30, 40 person calls where we had to do a reduction to the block reward for miners. We didn't have to, but like we wanted to, some people wanted to. So I got all the major mining pools in the call with the core devs. And I was like, hey, y'all, we want to do this because our argument is, and then there'd be arguments for like, we're overpaying for security, yada, yada, yada. And then eventually it'd be like, no one would want to make the decision. So like one time Piper Marion made the decision and one time I kind of made the decision, and that like, I didn't keep going when like no one was commenting. So yeah, coordination is hard is the number one thing I took away.
Were they upset about that?
Yeah, they were kind of upset about that. Yeah, that brings up a really interesting dynamic I'll go over real quick with the proof of work miners back in the day. So in Bitcoin, proof of work mining has a very interesting incentive system where like they know they have a lot of power, but the price will go down if they abuse that power potentially. I mean, now I'm not sure, but back then that was the case. Now it's like we have Luke Dash Jr. and weirdos trying to censor stuff and they're not doing anything and the price goes up. So but back then they were arguing if you lower the block reward, then miners are going to drop off and that will decrease security. And we were like, well, yeah, but we're paying you like like tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars a day for security. That's way too much for our chain right now because this was like 2018 or 2017. And also they were mad because we lowered it a separate time before and didn't get them involved. We just did it with the belief that they weren't that actively involved. Some of them are, especially the top two mining pools, were very involved in both early Ethereum and supporting the ecosystem. So yeah, it's just more of both a goodwill effort, but also to get their perspective in case we were missing something and to make sure everyone's heard were the three reasons that we did it that way. But yeah, the incentive was like, as long as it's profitable, they're not going to leave. Because like miners at the end of the day are there for profit. If not, I mean, early Ethereum, some of them weren't there for just profit. Sparkpool, which used to be ETH fans, would mine 0 transaction fee transactions for the first like 6 months to a year of Ethereum's mainnet launch. So it was one of those like, oh, they're with us. And like the biggest mining pool, I think it was called like Dwarf Pool or ETH Miner or something. They are the ones who then, from Bitfly, who made a lot of the staking stuff we use today, like the Beacon Chain website. So there was a lot of alignment, but at the same time, it's like, you're not going to run an unprofitable operation. So we kind of had to take a risk of, would they leave, if we lowered it, and like, how much would that actually decrease security? And it turned out they stayed. It actually, the price went up and the amount of mining hash power went up. So we did that 2 or 3 times and it always maintained that. So it was an interesting risk we took.
It's funny talking about all of these like actually really, really important protocol mechanics and sort of this like almost governance system. It's like, well, if no one vetoes it, then I guess we're moving forward with it. To what extent do you think that's still true today? Obviously, you've taken a step or a sort of an arm's length from what's going on, and Tim Bako has taken over a lot of things. But yeah, I'm very curious from your perspective, like how much all of that still stands true.
By the end of my time there, it was less and less about me saying, does anyone oppose? Okay, we're going through with it. Like I'd say 2020, 2021, that was mostly over by then because there was enough people. There'd be 15 to 30 people in calls. So like someone's going to speak up. And also there was a few other things that were implemented in that time, such as a more concrete agenda where like you go on GitHub and you open an issue and that's the agenda for the next one. So you can chat about it. I actually wrote about this on my blog and it's from a few years ago, but it still stands true about like how Ethereum governance breaks down as far as like the mechanisms in the social layer. And it's basically those core dev calls that are live. There's a Ethereum core dev chat. And it's always been public, which is also a really cool thing. It was on the chat service called Getter for a long time. Now it's in Discord, but people can still join. We don't like heavily advertise the link just to prevent trolls, but like there's a whole ETH R&D Discord that people usually know about if they're working in the protocol layer. And it's discussed there. We have the agenda. We have Ethereum Magicians. We have the EIP repo. So like between all of those, you can kind of parse what people are thinking even before you go in. I would study what positions Open Ethereum team versus Geth team versus, Nethermind, like what they were thinking before I went in there so that it wouldn't, like, I wouldn't have to like dig in during the call and be like, what do you think? I would just assume that people have looked at the chat log or something like that.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting, I think, more broadly to your point, when you have so many different people and stakeholders, and then you're trying to settle that all into code.
Yeah.
Which is not a simple feat.
Yeah, and the biggest thing is there's a lot of elements that people miss out when they think like protocol code, because it's not as easy as like, oh, suggest a change through an EIP. Everyone implement it. It goes in. We're happy. There's small ones that can do that. But like for the most part, behind the scenes, once you go through the whole flow, you talk about on Twitter or Ethereum Magicians or wherever, or ETH Research, an idea you have. Then you write a draft EIP. Then you go to the core developer calls, and there's something we've implemented that seems to have never really worked fully, but that I think they're looking to improve on, which is I forgot the acronym, but it's basically a status. It's not like written status or whatever necessarily, but it's like we had a problem where people were coming to the core dev calls or on one of the many communication platforms and saying, oh, we have this idea for like a pre-compile for a cryptographic curve so near the blockchain can better communicate with Ethereum. And it's like, oh, okay, cool, you have that idea. And they're like, and we have all the engineering resources and a ton of money to implement it on all the chains. And we're like, oh, okay. But then it's like they start doing that and we're like, well, we don't really want to do that. And then they get mad. And so we have this status that's, I don't even know if it's like actually enshrined in EIP1, but it's basically a status that's just like, hey, you have a preliminary, most of us agree this should go in, right? Like there's certain things where it's like, oh, unanimous, so you can go ahead with it and it's kind of clear. And there's others where it's like, they're like, we don't want to waste money unless we get kind of a thumbs up preliminarily from the core developers. And so that's what we started doing at some point near the end of my time doing those calls. The coolest thing though is, and people really are trying to do all this stuff with token governance and things around like, how can we redefine governance when it's been like a thing for thousands of years that people have like looked into deeply and looked at the incentive mechanisms back and forth. And I really think that people are really sleeping on social consensus because token governance, there's a lot of economic things about buying the tokens, staking power or hash power going down and that affecting the price, all this like invisible, like not knowing who certain stakers are, so you don't know if they're getting bribed or can't really even think about if they are because you don't know who they are. With us, it's like we have a very complicated system that's been around for a while. And if I were a nation state and I was trying to slip a bug into the Ethereum protocol, I would say it is absolutely impossible. It would literally cost them more time and money than worth it, and it would be caught because there's enough eyes looking at it. And along the way, there's intense testing too. There's manual test, there's fuzz testing. I like to think of fuzz testing as like you put the new code in like a software program that's running all the time. And if you have 1 + 1 = 2, or like A + B = C, and you can put in A + B or A and B as the variables, you can just throw like hot dog +1, or like you could say Q +1 and like see what the program does because it should crash every time. But every once in a while, you get something where you put in 2 weird artifacts and then it gives like an out of memory error or like a buffer overflow memory error. And you get access, to break the client, things like that. So fuzz testing is very important. We've caught a lot of bugs that way. And there's just so many levels to get through if you want to supplant the core dev calls that like, I'd say at this point, it's basically impossible. And I mean, that's what we want at the end of the day is that level of security. So for all its flaws, I can't see any kind of on-chain governance or token governance being that secure and battle tested as ours.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of framing it. It's cool to hear about all the sort of nonchalance of the early days, but now I think things have progressed to a point where there is this entire deep governance at the social layer and like checks and balances to ensure that we don't screw anything up. So sort of like continuing that thought, let's maybe look more at the present and into the future of what the Ethereum core devs are thinking about and sort of like what the next big improvements are to be made. If you were running the core dev calls, what would be the conversations that you would be interested in having moving forward? Are there like big EIPs that you're excited about? I know there's some like drama on Twitter right now about the account abstraction EIPs. But yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I think that if I was doing it today, so just to preface, I'm a bit out of the loop on like layer 1 EIP stuff currently, except the stuff that kind of gets, put on Twitter and things like that, which is fine because a lot of it is kind of menial or like, especially at the networking level, like people are not going to understand or care about it. You know what I mean? So account abstraction stuff, that is so confusing to me because like, there is this impression, I think, that makes people nervous, and this has happened throughout the history of Ethereum, that like, oh, if Ethereum Foundation endorses it, or someone from the Ethereum Foundation writes it, or like Vitalik writes it, or then it becomes almost like definitely it's going into a network upgrade. And I think that's what a lot of people think about Yoav Weiss, who's done an amazing job at coordinating a lot of stuff for account abstraction. But I think it's 4337, which is Yoav's idea of it and what they want to go in, and a number of other people. the people who are really cheering for 4337, some of them have startups that are venture funded that rely on 4337 or have built their stuff all around 4337. So I think people who haven't looked at the history of account abstraction are going to look at that and say like, oh, this looks fishy, or, oh, they're just wanting to do this because of their, VC investment or things like that. And I don't have an answer to that necessarily, except to say that account abstraction in itself has been an idea for, since 2017. 2017 was DevCon 3 in Cancun. And I was both co-running DevCon 3 and I was also doing some stuff with core devs and other people. So we had a core dev kind of semi-meeting in Cancun where we had a lot of the core devs sit around this huge table and we talked about stuff like kind of the future, like what we wanted to be put in. And I said, oh, are we still doing account abstraction? And they were like, nah, that seems kind of hard right now. We're going to do something else. I was like, all right, whatever y'all want to do. And a lot of the issues with early account abstraction ideas is not as much the idea that a EOA or like an externally owned address, the kind that you generate from a MetaMask or a ledger, the fact that was turning into a smart contract, like that's a cool thing. What they didn't like about account abstraction, or they meaning some of the community members, especially ones who were trading, is that back then at least, and to an extent now, a lot of the account abstraction proposals allow you to pay for gas in any token you want. And back then, it was early enough still that a lot of people were worried, well, you're going to be taking value from Ethereum, which is a narrative we've heard over and over again with stuff like L2s, where it's like, oh, you're building an L2 and it has a token that's not ETH, then you're extracting value, which we're kind of seeing now that is not the case. Although I would say that I can see way back then when things were smaller that being a concern. I don't see that today. And it seems like no one else really is bringing that up as a concern. But just to say, there's been so many, like so many account abstraction EIPs like since 2017. And only now have we kind of coalesced around some of these. I don't know. And then I think there's like 3074 or something that's starting to get like a little bit of memeability, which is like different than 4337. And yeah, I think that there is a lot at stake for getting this right. And I think more people should join the conversation. There are plenty of EIPs that have had like long discussions and long implementation and bugs found. And there's specifically a curve that was put in 2018 that would allow compatibility with Zcash. It was like I forgot what it is. I'll butcher it. But either way, there's a curve that like would work at the time with Zcash's crypto. But then they updated, Zcash did, years later, to Orchid, which is an upgrade of theirs that changed the curve. So it's like, also, no one was using it even after that. Like we put the precompile in, no one used it. And there was years of debate for that precompile. So it's like there's a lot of hesitancy for anything new, which is kind of cool. And it's kind of over time ossifying things. But yeah, that makes it very hard to have discussions like this because you have a lot of DApp devs who may not get all of the ideas around it. And then you have protocol devs who may be looking more at the technical and not the usages. The last thing I'd say that I'd be very interested in is the L2 to L1 discussions that are going on. I'm actually, because I work at Polygon Labs, I am involved in the discussions that we have with all the L2 teams and the L1. Recently, there's been a few different chats spin up. There's now one that's kind of becoming the chat. And it has every L2 team and then people also from the core dev calls, because there are some curves that would make like certain things in L2s a whole lot cheaper. So some opcodes, some ways of doing things. And then there's also different structures in a block. So like right now we have Merkle tries. So basically it's either a Patricia try or a Merkle try, depending on who's really opinionated on how you say it. But either way, it's a way to navigate through data that's put in a block in a very efficient way if the data is structured in a certain format. So that's been the case forever. But there are newer data structures and ones that work a lot better with ZK or optimistic rollup architecture for rollups that L2s want to put in. So they want to coalesce on that as L2s, but also say, so if we do this, hey, Ethereum, L1, are you going to help us out here? And vice versa with L1 wondering what L2s are doing. So it may, because there's a big push for EVM compatibility or EVM near compatibility. So you can take a contract from L1, push it to L2, which can happen today. But with it, once you start to put this other stuff in, it breaks compatibility. So then it's like, well, we want compatibility. Ethereum, L1, do this. And then they're like, well, I don't know. And so now we're all talking, and that's good. And there's kind of I think there's like roll-up improvement proposals. So it's like a new L2 kind of thing that's happening there. The last part of that, I guess, would be it's very, very, very difficult to figure out what priority should be. So I'd be very interested in redefining how priority is structured in the all core devs, because it's still pretty chaotic. It was chaotic when I did it, and I don't even have the right answers because we've tried to redo things a number of times. But yeah, to figure out what should go in and when can be a popularity game to an extent. It's like 1559, account abstraction, all that stuff. So.
And to some degree, there's kind of like an argument that it should be, right? Where, to your point, when you enshrine things in the protocol and then people don't use them, that is a frustrating process and feels like that's a reflection of maybe poor prioritization or, misconceptions around what's actually going to be useful for people. Whereas, to your point, like L2s are A, popular, but B, part of that is true because they're actively writing to the L1. And so there is an interesting dynamic there around like testing things out, seeing what actually gains popularity, and then enshrining those things, as opposed to designing these like huge and interesting specs that are very complex and exciting, but actually get very little usage.
Absolutely. The biggest, to dive to the deepest technical levels of also why this is hard, because it's exactly what you said, but a lot of the things that L2s to L1s need, or just any kind of bridging, compatibility with other stuff, they usually involve either changes to the data structure. So like getting Verkle tries instead of Merkle tries. And so that the L2s know how to publish the data to the L1s, but also opcodes. So an opcode is something at the very, very like lowest layer of a client where a certain very computationally intensive stuff that you would do in a Solidity contract. So let's say a SHA-256 hash. So if I take the word Hudson and SHA-256 it in Solidity, every computer who runs that Solidity contract has to do it. But computationally, it's a very intense thing compared to an add, which is like 1 + 1 = 2. So every client has a set of precompiles and opcodes being the general one where you do like add, subtract, and sometimes they're at the lowest level. Sometimes it's like you actually run them per computer. The lowest level ones that are always in there are precompiles. So we have add, subtract, SHA-256, SHA-3, which is really kekak. And so all of those are in every computer because you don't want the CPU to be running a SHA-256 hash every single time. So you put that kind of cheat code on that precompile at the lowest level of every client so that if my Solidity contract runs a SHA-256, or the client itself can just run it and it doesn't have to use like general computing that is running the entire rest of the contract. So for very advanced cryptographic operations that would take a ton of gas just because of how advanced they are, you don't have to use as much gas. They're not free, obviously, because that's a DOS vector, but you have to do these new precompiles if you want something very cryptographically intensive to happen. So whenever you introduce a precompile like the Zcash one, every client, so like Nethermind, Geth, Aragon, etc., they all have to implement the same cryptography in the library. Well, rarely are there cryptographic libraries that are compatible with every language that is used for Ethereum clients. So like Rust, .NET, and Go. So everyone has to pick a different library. So you have to hope that all three of those libraries are all talking to each other correctly, or there's no bugs. Most of the chain splits or incidents we've had on Ethereum, including things that fuzzers have found, like during upgrades, has been because of precompile or some opcodes that have libraries in the clients that one of them fails and then that causes a chain split. And the reason for that is there's not cryptographers on every team. There might be like one, and then there also are cryptography teams across the ecosystem who'd be willing to help. But again, it's a coordination problem. So all that to say, at this point, because of all the shit that's happened over the last 8 years when it's come to these precompiles, core devs are very wary about putting precompiles in because it's like, why would we do this? Because if it breaks, they don't know how to fix it either. They can identify where the fix happened, but it's like, what's this cryptography crap? Like, I don't know this. So now the chain's down and we have to find a cryptographer who also knows Go or knows Geth and Go. And like they exist, but it's like we don't want to have to rely on that when the core, because the core devs would feel unsafe. They know they'd get blamed. So that's one of the things that people don't understand when they're like, well, why don't they just put that in? It's not like we're writing it from scratch like other things.
Yeah. I mean, it's like any other sort of risk reward. And if you're not paying attention to what these like long tail risks are, it seems like the obvious thing to do is just to add it. And that doesn't account for those sort of failure scenarios, or even just like the general maintenance of having like all this extra code that's just in the client that's not being touched. I wanted to touch on what you're up to now at Polygon. Can you give us sort of the high level of what your role is as the VP of community?
Sure. So basically, first I'll just say that I was, advising Polygon since it became Polygon from, Matic. So a little over like 2.5 years ago. And I've been very impressed with how Polygon has progressed on a technical level. They really have the top talent when it comes to zero knowledge related stuff, whether it's privacy or scaling through their ZK rollups and ZK EVM efforts. Something else that I'd say is there are a lot of really, really, really good L2 teams. And my goal was to try to join a team that, I mean, obviously I would get along with people and stuff like that, but that would also have like a huge impact on Ethereum. So I decided on Polygon because they have the best tech. And it's also, I already knew people there, stuff like that. So I was brought in to help with a number of things. One of them was work with the governance team on some of the Polygon 2.0 stuff, which was what we released to, move the token from Matic to POL, change up some of the economics, basically redo this old Matic token and infrastructure and how things are decided in the ecosystem. And so the team was already doing great on that, by the way. Shout out to Mateusz and the whole team there. But I was helping them kind of find avenues to be more public about that and draw in people to the forums and other places, since I had done EIPs before and stuff like that. And they have similar core dev calls. And now I'm working on the community aspect because if I'm being honest, and I mean, pretty much everyone knows this, Polygon generally, maybe not as of late because of some things we've done on a technical level, was known as kind of the business development, like kind of chain for a bit. Like there's like, oh, we, did a Starbucks thing or we have this and that. And honestly, that is incredibly needed and very, very undervalued among, L2s that are trying to come up into the ecosystem. But I think it's kind of been tilted and less for the technical and community side and more for that, because I would ask people like, oh, what's Polygon building? And they'd be like, we don't know, but we know that they have this cool thing. And so I'm like, oh, okay. So now what I'm doing is I'm integrating with different layers of the community that Polygon wants to improve upon, a lot of it being the technical community. We basically want people to know that they can come to Polygon, especially as founders, especially as new people, and have the resources to learn things. So there's like a huge effort on redoing the documentation. There's a huge effort on making our events at conferences like a lot more focused on tech and a lot more focused on builders and things like that. And not even in a cringy way. Like we just kind of don't want to do a thing that just seems like, oh, we're trying to sell ourselves. Like we're really wanting to legitimately give back, but a lot of it is like there's ways to do it that are better or more beneficial to more people than others. So I kind of just go in there and help with different community initiatives. Right now, a really big one that I'm most excited about is our CDK initiatives. So we are getting more cohesion among CDK teams. And I should probably mention what CDK is. So CDK is our modular rollups stack. So basically, you can go in and open the CDK repo and you can pick between different types of EVMs, like an EWASM. You can pick like a normal EVM. Eventually, you might be able to do the SVM if that gets integrated. You can pick different data availability layers like Celestia. Celestia is one of the people who are integrating there. So you kind of mix and match your own blockchain to an extent with the ultimate goal of providing a layer of interoperability between all those CDK chains. And yeah, it's really, really cool stuff. There's a lot of people working on it who are very excited. So yeah, but a lot of these teams are coming together and it's like, oh, they should all be talking to each other, have a direct line to a lot of our engineers in case they have questions. So I'm facilitating creating that ecosystem to an extent, and also making sure that people outside of Polygon know, hey, you can come into this chat room. We're friendly. We'll actually be here to answer questions and stuff like that. So yeah, 2024 is going to be really all about people who are building, people who we want to help succeed in their blockchain goals. We have something called Polygon Village, which is a grants platform we launched with a bunch of money so people can come and get resources from there. And yeah, things are really looking up on just a lot of different things at Polygon. I'm really excited.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned with some of the CDK stuff, the ability to spin up your own chain. I feel like this is a trend that we're seeing, with like Conduit, making it easy to launch optimistic rollups and all of this stuff. And it sounds like Polygon is thinking a lot about this. I'm curious, when you thought several years ago about what scaling Ethereum looked like, did you picture there would be the Zora network and all of these individual app-specific rollups? I'm curious how that's evolved over time and what you think the future of that looks like.
Yeah. So I actually think back to a few years ago because people would be like, oh, what does the future of blockchain look like? And I'd usually say two things. The first one, which is the most important one, is I don't want to know I'm using a blockchain. Once that happens, we've established mainstream status. You don't know what's happening when you send a Venmo payment. It is really interesting, but you don't know what's happening, and you don't have to do anything about it. That's kind of what I'm wanting to happen here. But even with smart contract calls and data transfer, the second thing is I kind of envisioned a future where there's the internet and then there's business networks. So like if I go and work at a real estate job, there's like an intranet where you can share files and send stuff to a printer, but it doesn't talk to the internet, but it grabs stuff from the internet and selectively sends to the internet. And that's how I kind of pictured blockchains eventually. So like my phone would have a blockchain, but it wouldn't be a thing where it's like a blockchain that is just me on the chain, but more just like having these shared security models in such a way that there's a lot of these interoperable blockchains that are all sharing from the same shared security layer or things with certain elements of social recovery. So like all three of us could be on a blockchain and each one of us do like a proof of authority sharing thing for stuff that's like low value. So like if we all want to place small bets on a football game, we might want a blockchain if we want to interact with other blockchains, grab Oracle data that is like necessary and we don't want to pay a ton of money on a main chain. So yes, I kind of saw this coming, not exactly how this worked. But if you go back, one thing I said on another podcast recently, what's incredibly interesting is to go back to 2015, look up the DevCon 0 videos, which was the first DevCon, like 50 people. It's actually, there's a DevCon archive. If you go to the DevCon website where it lists them all and you can look up certain ones, it's a really cool interface. But if you look back then at like what the ideas were and like the diagrams of like what blockchain and Ethereum would become, they had these three main things they were really pushing, which was there would be the messaging layer, like Whisper, which would be a blockchain messaging layer. And then there was like data storage, which would be Swarm. And Swarm's now spun out and doing their own thing. And then you would have the smart contract layer, which is Ethereum. And now we just really have Ethereum in the Ethereum ecosystem for the most part. I mean, Swarm's still involved, and then Whisper became something that Status was making. But either way, like that entirely fell apart. And then you can go 2 years later to other DevCons and be like, oh, what were they talking about there? And then it just changes so quickly and so much that I know in broad strokes there's going to be a ton of interoperability. And the people who are kind of like frowning on like, oh, these blockchains can't talk to each other, like, this is way crazier than I ever thought would happen, like what we have today. And these ideas and a lot of them coming back to basics are just so exciting to me that like I'm very confident that it will look in the future like there's a lot more interoperability, especially with the modular stuff. Like, you just have to kind of figure out where each piece connects to each other piece.
Well, it's funny too, because, interoperability is arguably one of the most interesting elements of blockchains. So like the fact that technical limitations would cause that to not be feasible seems in hindsight dumb, basically, where it's like, no, we were going to make it happen. How secure is interoperability right now is a different question, but
Yeah.
We're getting there, and hopefully in the future, we look back and we're like, of course we were going to make,
People get jaded by the
Everything
bridge
safe and all
hacks.
that.
That's the main thing. People get jaded by
Yeah.
the bridge hacks, and if you're not deep in the weeds, it just looks entirely different, which I don't blame anyone for. Like, I don't understand how refrigerators work, and if there was like some huge thing with refrigerators that makes it like better, like I wouldn't keep up with it. So if my fridge breaks, I'm gonna be like, oh, this company's terrible. So like, yeah.
Yeah,
It's easier just to
exactly.
throw shade when you're less involved. But I like the way you're describing your vision of the future of scaling blockchains. It's sort of like you can imagine this fractal of layers and modularity that manages to keep this balance between security and modularity, but also just like the open standardization. Like one of the huge benefits of blockchain is just this alternative to these like closed source APIs where you have to go ask a single company to like add something to their API to get data from it. Or you see things like Reddit that just straight up close down their API. Twitter's basically closed, priced out at least. Whereas like the blockchain is this complete 180 alternative where everything is just entirely open. And if you could do that in such a way that maintains security, then it doesn't really matter what the implementation details are to get there.
Oh, for sure. I like that ideal. I think it's going to look different. And there are people who are here in the community, like the blockchain and Ethereum community, that were here in the early internet and like shaped some of that. They give all these warnings like, be careful. We all want to be open, but then the companies will come. And I'm like, you're right.
Well, Hudson, amazing time chatting with you. Really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got a very busy schedule. I know we've got the holidays coming up. Happy holidays. Thank you so much. Where can people find you online?
Thanks, you two, so much for having me on. This was amazing. I never get to dive this deep into technical stuff anymore. And it's so funny because people don't even know I'm technical a lot of the time. So, but yeah, no, you can find me on Twitter at Hudson Jameson. You can also find me on my website, hudsonjameson.com, but I have not posted there in a while. But there are some kind of interesting blogs from back in the day. Oh, my cat's also saying hi. Hello.
You're truly the cat herder. Well, Hudson, thank you so much for coming on the pod. It was so wonderful to have you on the show.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.